It's Louis Ortiz from Monbi.com, and I'm very excited today. We are talking to Amanda Ogen today. And Amanda is an amazing podcaster, and she has a podcast called How Did I Get This Far? And I want to just chat with her a little bit about her experience and kind of learn a little bit about her podcast. And Amanda, welcome to the Monbi show. Can you just share with our viewers a little bit about yourself and your background?
Of course. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is super exciting. But yeah, I'll tell a little bit about me. So my background is actually in television production. I work in TV casting. I've done scripted TV, so with actors, as well as unscripted TV, so reality shows, game shows, prank shows, and as well as coordinating audience for different types of shows like those as well. And it is so much fun. And I think it really helped me with my passion of starting my podcast because I have a lot of experience talking to all different types of people, interviewing them, getting to know their stories, and really learning and growing from knowing the people around me.
I think that's awesome. I think that's really awesome. Tell me a little bit about, what was your inspiration? I mean, what inspired you to start a podcast?
Absolutely. So, originally I had this idea that I wanted to exist. I just didn't know what platform made the most sense. Podcasts were still kind of confusing. I don't think anyone even fully grasps them still today. But when I had this idea of a podcast, this idea of a story about learning how to do basic skills, I didn't know what platform to use. I really liked YouTube. And then I'm sure you can imagine, as a girl who doesn't know how to do a lot of things, I didn't know how I could possibly make a YouTube show. So I just forgot about it. I let it go. We always have those ideas and we're just like, I'm never going to pursue them. And then when I started listening to podcasts, I realized that this platform made a lot of sense, even more than YouTube, because with YouTube, we don't really go to learn how-tos on YouTube until we absolutely need to learn them. If your car has a flat tire, you're not looking what to do about it until you have that flat tire. Maybe we want to know what to do before that happens and have this anxiety. And I think that that's what podcasts are great for, because you can listen to them as you're going about your day, doing other things. And you might have that like Slumdog Millionaire effect where you learn something once and then down the road, you're going to need it. And so that's why I wanted to do my podcast. So How Did I Get This Far is all about basic life skills. And it can be anything. It doesn't just have to be like things related to your car, how to brush your teeth, how to wash your hair, but also more fun things, best tips for traveling, how to get on a reality show, different types of fun concepts that we all wish we knew. We just haven't had a chance to learn.
Yeah, and you got some great topics, and I really enjoy the podcast. Really, really creative. What do you wish you knew before you started that maybe you didn't know?
So, going back to your question about what made me start this, honestly, I don't know how to do a lot of things. I've always been good at, like I said, I'm good with talking with people, getting people to kind of help me do things. And I've been like avoiding learning them because they're so stressful. Anything from like taxes or just other adult paperwork, like getting health insurance, getting car insurance, buying a car, buying a house, all those things. I'm mentally preparing to have the people I love help me. And I got to a point where I was so sick of feeling like I needed to lean on people. And of course, I still plan to do it, but I want to be able to be a little more self-sufficient, a little more confident, and a little less stressed when I know these moments are going to come up in my life. So like I said, even just the ones with washing hair, I had a hairstylist come in and talk about what shampoos to use, what on earth is leave-in conditioner, all kinds of things that, we get to a point where it's a little embarrassing that we don't know this stuff already.
Yeah.
But I don't have any shame admitting that I don't know these things. So that's where I host it and ask the questions that we all wish we knew. And I have my expert guests give the insights so that we all are prepared for the future.
I think it's really, really cool. I mean, how do you come up with the topic ideas?
Honestly, well, a lot of it is just from my own experience. When I first started brainstorming for my podcast, so before I started recording, I had a whole spreadsheet of all my ideas, all my questions. And then over time, people just kept giving me their questions and their ideas. And I just have like the notes in my phone and I write down, they're like, hey, like, do you know what to do when like my bananas start rotting? And I'm like, oh, good question. I'm going to add that to my podcast.
Yeah.
So different things like that. And I just throw it all into my spreadsheets. And then as I'm recruiting my guests, I review my notes, review the questions from my guests. I usually post on social media as well, asking for any last minute questions, and then incorporate that into my episodes.
Awesome. And by the way, for those of you that don't know Amanda yet, we're going to have links to all her social media and her podcast. And I really encourage you to check it out. It's a great podcast.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Amanda, what resources do you use, or what resources do you wish you had when you were starting your podcast? You mentioned
So
YouTube experimenting and such, and
yeah, so it's so funny. The irony of this podcast is that I don't know how to do anything, and yet I have to do all of this and kind of figure out how to do all of this on my own, which in a way is great. It's almost like my baby, and it's like pushing me to like be a better person and like learn these things, not just in my topics, but doing the podcast itself. And so with the resources, I got very lucky. One of the things I did, I joined a bunch of different podcast Facebook groups. And there was this one Facebook group that connected me with this man named Brad Nolan. And he kind of guided me through the basics because I had so much anxiety starting this. I didn't know what I was doing. And he was answering my questions, kind of was like a mentor for me at one point. So and then, just over time, just a lot of research. You learn about different companies like Monbi, like being a great resource for people who are pursuing new opportunities, entrepreneurs, and finding these resources. It just takes a little bit of research, a little bit of effort. But once you find them, it's so helpful. And just being willing to ask questions and being open to admitting you don't know something is okay, because then people are going to want to help you. And I've noticed that about the podcast community is people are very supportive. It's a very competitive field because there's so many podcasts, but people want to like be there for each other. And I love that. And any podcaster I've reached out to has been coming back to me with open arms. And I've just been really grateful for that.
I think that is so cool. And, I wanted to lead into that. You have some amazing guests, and one of them that you had was Ben Higgins. And I'm gonna ask you a question about that. Maybe you can just share with our viewers who Ben Higgins is. But how did you get that type of level of person on your podcast, and how do you get people on your podcast in general? And maybe share with us who Ben Higgins is for those of you that don't know.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love talking about it because I'm a huge Bachelor fan. So Ben Higgins was the Bachelor. He was obviously a contestant first, and then he was the Bachelor a few years ago, and he's still very prevalent in the Bachelor Nation franchise. He is also a podcast host as well, and he was known on his season of The Bachelor on ABC as the philanthropic guy. The perfect Ben was like his tagline, because he's just a really great person. I am still shocked that I got him as a guest. I was so fortunate, so lucky, so grateful.
So cool.
And I know I still very happy about it. And you can listen to the episode and you'll hear I'm very giddy and I try to get myself together a little bit. But so how I got him, it's actually funny. One of the topics I always wanted to have in the beginning of my podcast was about coffee, because I feel like everyone understands coffee and how to make it and what it is. And I just don't. I never understood. I just didn't get it. So I knew I wanted to do an episode on coffee. I started researching different coffee companies. I came across Caveman Coffee Co., which is the company whose CEO, Lacey Mackey, I had as my guest. But I was nervous that, it was my first recording. It wasn't my first released episode, but it was my first recording. And I was so nervous because, again, it's a new world for me. So just in case, I started researching other small coffee companies. And I came across this one called Generous Coffee. And I'm looking through the website and I noticed that they do a lot of philanthropic work. They donate their money to other charities. And I thought that was really cool. So I reached out to them, kind of back up, just in case I don't hear back from Caveman Coffee Company, and did my episode with Caveman, moved on, forgot about Generous. And then I got an email from their director of communications, Maddie Short. And she said, hey, our CEO, our president, Ben Higgins, would love to be a guest. And I was like, did she just say Ben Higgins? I looked back at their website and I was like, oh my God, Ben. I was like, okay, I got to figure this out. I need to use him. How do I get him on my podcast? And then I remembered he was known for being really philanthropic. This company does good things. They consider themselves a for-purpose business. And I was like, well, an even better conversation with Ben would be about tips on volunteering. Not everybody really understands when they donate, where does it go? How much should I donate? All these basic other questions about a topic that, I planned on covering eventually, but I was like, this is my opportunity. I'll cover this now with him. And talked with his team and got that as our topic and had him as my guest. It went great. He was so lovely. He threw a couple compliments at me, which I absolutely kept in my episode. So it was super fun and he was wonderful.
Very cool. That is awesome. Do you give them questions in advance or any advice when they're going to go on your podcast, your guests? How do you do that?
Yeah. So, to bring up how I recruit my guests. So that was just literally going on Google, looking up coffee companies. That's how I found him. Any resource is an option though. Instagram, Facebook, social media, of course. TikTok has been a big one for me because TikTok has a lot of resources for different hacks and life skills. And then once I find somebody who's really nailed it, I'll reach out to them. But as far as once I've recruited them and they've expressed interest, then I do send them questions. I write them out. It takes a long time to put all my questions together, whether it's questions from my listeners, my own questions from my files of my questions I had waiting, or just looking up online basic, typical questions that are really common that people have, just so I can save them from having to YouTube it and Google it in the future. So I put all those together, put my notes about their intro, put my notes about everything, send that to them, have them review it so that they're comfortable and confident. All my guests, I'm sure, could totally do it just without preparation, but I want to make sure that they know exactly what's going to happen. And I like to keep my episodes rather typically concise. I want to really get all the information in and out because I know if anyone listening is like me, I don't have much of an attention span. So I want to get the information in before it feels like a lecture.
Yep.
So I definitely like to prepare as much as I can.
Cool. Very cool. I really like the format. So, and I like that they're like you said, they're very short and they get right to the punch and they're very entertaining. So it's very awesome. So tell me about monetization. Do you have any plans to monetize the podcast, or have you been talking to sponsors or that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I would love for this to be a profitable project. I've definitely received some gifts and I've received some advice on how to monetize. I haven't yet. Again, I've received wine. When I did my wine episode, I did a wine Instagram live, like a wine tasting. And so the company shared wine with me. Caveman Coffee Co. shared some of their coffee with me. I even actually wore some bracelets. I had a friend who's also a fan of the podcast make these cute little bracelets. So, I've had great opportunities. Oh, and this podcast shirt as well. A company called Rush Crush kind of partnered with me to make these cute shirts. So cool opportunities have happened. Nothing that is with a brand yet. Again, I'm still a one-woman show here, and it's so much work doing the social media and the episodes and the preparation and recruiting, all of that. So I've been focusing a lot on the content, making sure that the validity of my concept is really coming across. But I would love to put even more effort into this. Maybe even have a team that I can share some kind of compensation with them for it. So I'd love to monetize. I'd love to be able to do that. I think partnerships, in my mind when I started this podcast, it seemed very obvious that my partnerships could be with other companies that can make our lives easier, especially basic things. So it could be house cleaning tips or cooking resources, different things like that. So definitely in the future, I'd love to do some advertising like that, sponsorships like that. So hopefully soon that'll be coming.
That'll be very cool. So this kind of leads into my next question. We talked a little bit about monetization, but where do you see your podcast going in, say, maybe the next year or 5 years or even beyond?
Yeah, hopefully, this does continue to grow. It's been doing very well so far. I had one of my podcast episodes hit almost 700 downloads. So it's definitely in the right direction. It's doing really well. It's only been one season, and then I do still work full time in my TV production world. So all of this being a side hustle. So I'm hoping one day it can grow and be not just a side hustle, but a little more in the forefront. And if that happens, maybe I partner with a network that hosts their podcasts, or, it being monetized so that I love my job. I want to continue in TV production. I love it, but it kind of is comparable to podcasting because that is a form of broadcasting as well. So I would love to kind of just balance both in my life and see where that goes. Have more guests that are really stand out and have really great background to share really good advice. And also just other ways of sharing these resources. Social media is so awesome. And I feel like as a one-woman team, I can't take full advantage yet. Showing these different tips, showing me failing at them, things like that. I would love to try to do that even more. And then, of course, just providing even more opportunities with this for, having more guests. If I have a studio, I can actually coordinate that better. And right now I record in a closet. So one day, hopefully a real room would be awesome.
Well, you're doing awesome. I'm so excited to see the transition and the growth of your podcast. It's really exciting.
Thank you.
With this, I mean, I know that you've had a lot of successes and maybe some struggles. In starting your podcast, what would you say was one of your biggest struggles and maybe one of your biggest successes?
Sure. So one thing I definitely learned right from the beginning was patience. I've never really had patience before. And I learned that kind of like what I was mentioning with the coffee story. I mean, it ended up benefiting me because I had Ben as a guest, but I rushed to find another guest because someone didn't respond as quickly as I wanted. Or, I get really frustrated the guest didn't answer me. It's like, this isn't their world, Amanda. Like, give it a break. Make sure you're patient. So I would say that's my biggest struggle that I learned very early on. So once I recognized that, I learned patience. And then I would say my biggest moment that kind of shook me, and I mentioned this in one of my final podcasts from my first season, was I had entered a contest and I put all of this material together and I felt super confident about my submission of my podcast, thinking that it would kind of be like the easy way out of just having someone sort of not buy it, but take my podcast under their wing and turn it into this big gargantuan podcast. And I didn't make to the top 10. And while most people would be like, well, of course you didn't, like, it's a big contest, I was kind of like, wait, but I really believed in this podcast. Like, where did I go wrong? And made me start questioning. And I was like, no, Amanda, that's not healthy. Like, there's going to be a better outlet. This wasn't for you. Your path is coming. Just keep doing what you're doing. And I would say, kind of to wrap that in a bow, my definite biggest advice is to kind of go back to what was the point, the reason I started my podcast. And the reason I started was because of the concept, the idea that I wish I learned these basic skills before my anxiety kicked in. So I remembered that and realized, like, got to keep doing that. That is the point. It's not about making money. It's not about making this famous. It's not about any of that. It's about just getting what I want to exist out there. But my biggest success, I know Ben Higgins, we mentioned it a lot. I think we can really like dig into that one, but I would also just say, I released my podcast in the beginning of the pandemic, used it, as that opportunity to pursue a new hobby. Right. And so I finally started it, and about a month into me releasing my podcast, that's when the Black Lives Matter protests began. And that's when there was something that was called Blackout Tuesday, where nobody was releasing content unless it was from a Black voice, being able to speak and share what they weren't able to share before. And it was about to be my second episode that day. And I was like, okay, this is my moment to kind of learn, what do I do? Do I release? Do I not? Do I do an episode about this? Like, am I even in the right to do that? It was so stressful. It was in the middle of the night too. I was like, what do I do? And so I canceled that episode I had. I moved it to the following week. And I reached out to a friend of mine asking what I should do. And he said, why don't you do an episode discussing this? Because again, it could be about the basics of this whole concept of the protest and why it exists and what our struggles are today. And why don't you do it with my mom? And his mom was a Black role model I had growing up in high school, who was just an amazing woman and was very open to sharing her experiences and her notes. So we put our notes together and we shared that. And I was so nervous. That was like not the worst week of my life, but that was a really hard week doing that research, prepping for it, the anxiety of doing it wrong. But fortunately, it went as a really great conversation. I definitely learned a lot. Got to reconnect with an old role model of mine too, and then share some basic skills and some basic knowledge and some more resources with my listeners. So that was super rewarding to me.
I think that's really awesome. And one of the things talking to you right now is I feel that passion. I feel that excitement in your voice, and I see it. And I think that, for me looking from the outside in, I think that's one of the, I'd say, biggest success. I can tell this is a really happy space for you. And I'm really proud of what you've done. And it's really amazing. So
that's so sweet. Thank you.
Yeah, I see that passion from you. That's so great to see. What advice would you give for anybody out there that's looking to start a podcast?
Okay, so I'm going to really sink this one into everyone listening. When you're starting pretty much any journey, but if you're starting a podcast, especially, a podcast being something that doesn't automatically make you money if you're not famous or if you're not working immediately with a broadcast company, you need to hone it into what is the reason you're starting this podcast. For me, it was to get rid of some of the stress, the frustration, the overwhelming feeling you have when you're facing a basic life skill, especially as you're growing up as an adult, that you feel like maybe you should have known before, or that you just are too embarrassed to admit you don't know, or that you just do wrong, or it takes a lot of time and you don't have time. It's just so stressful. So I wanted to combat that in a way that I haven't seen before. I looked up to see if this podcast existed, and there were similar ones, but there wasn't one just actually talking about basic skills and getting that knowledge across. So for me, I wanted to create something that I thought would help me and help others, and also give it a space for people that might want to, share, because some of my guests aren't guests that would normally be recruited for a podcast, people with different skills that don't really get interviewed. So that was my reason. And I think all of the hours, all the time, all the sacrifice of other things that I missed out on because I focused so much on my podcast, I had to remember, okay, why am I doing this? Why am I changing what I do day to day? Why am I spending all this time doing this research? And it's because of everything I just said. There's this big reason, there's this big push, there's this big drive to get me to do something. Like you said, there's this passion to make it happen. And that, I think, is the most important thing, to remember why you're doing it, what's pushing you to do it, and why you want it to continue to grow.
I think that is awesome. That is great advice. So really appreciate that.
Thank you.
So
Yeah.
Amanda, where can our viewers learn more about you? What are some other, I'll put the notes here in the show notes here, but tell us a little bit more about other places where we can reach out to you.
Yeah, sure. So again, my podcast, How Did I Get This Far, is available on pretty much any podcast platform, Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, all those basic platforms, and as well as many others. And as far as the social media end for the podcast, on Instagram, it's at How Did I Get This Far Pod. A little bit of a tongue twister there, but that's the username. On Facebook, How Did I Get This Far page. I'm also on Twitter, but I'm not even going to share that one because I am not doing well with that one. If anyone's good at Twitter, let me know. I could use you. And then my personal, at Amanda Ogen. Ogen is Ogen. Feel free to connect with me. I always check all my messages and everything. So if you have any basic skills you want to share, or basic skills that you wish that we would cover, let me know. Always open to advice and suggestions, and any feedback too.
And I'll put all your links here in the show notes for anybody that wants to connect with that. And Amanda, I just want to thank you. Thank you for taking the time to do this. On Monbi, we like to help entrepreneurs, start, grow, and scale businesses. And your story is very inspirational. And I'm really anxious to see how your podcast progresses and your next growth. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much. This is awesome. You are awesome. And hopefully we'll connect again. And I'm excited to learn more about Monbi and check it out and see how your company grows as well.
Thanks, Amanda. It was great chatting with you today.
You too. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.